And we're live. Welcome everyone to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, October 13th, 2021. We'll be following along in the agenda that was posted, I believe in issue number, I think it was 474. And I'll just copy and paste for folks that have just joined the meeting notes doc in the chat. Feel free to add yourselves as attendees. As usual, we ask that folks that are joining on these calls and are communicating with us on the RFC's repo, please abide by the code of conduct and please be kind and thoughtful to each other and respectful of each other when we're speaking. Please raise your hand if somebody else is speaking and you would like to add a comment. And just quickly, in terms of announcements, I wanted to note that last week we did cut a major version of the NPM CLI, NPM 8, which was essentially the primary breaking change was dropping node support and updating a few deps, including Node.js. So if you haven't already, please go grab the latest version of NPM if you can. Yeah, we've essentially just dropped Node 10 support in that major. Want to give some space for folks if anybody else has other announcements they wanted to share.
Actually, just wanted to tack on what you just said, Darcy. I think the big thing one of the big things to take away from this major release is that effectively, we're still working on the same set of bugs that this doesn't mean that NPM 7 is quote finished. It just means that we're continuing to work on NPM 7 in NPM 8.
That's a great note. Unlike 6 to 7, this wasn't a massive refactoring of code as much of a change. So the hope is that we're going to continue to address bugs that would have been filed already against v7. And I think a few of these issues that we have on the agenda today speak to that. So any other announcements or comments, I guess, on that? If not, then we can dive right into the agenda. The first item that we have, and I think the one that is probably the most important, is the RFC 472. This was created by Rebecca. I think this is a follow-up to an issue that you filed a little while back, but I'll let you speak to the context.
Sure. So this is a NPM 7 behavior that makes it so that under certain circumstances, scoped modules are impossible to install. And specifically, if you're using a third-party registry that returns, that does not, that is a, partial proxy. So yeah, you publish some private modules to it maybe, but the rest of it is just returning the public registry URLs for its packages. In that scenario, and only for scoped modules, the package URLs get rewritten to follow the npm.js registry format, but on the currently specified registry, rather than using the package URL, the tarball URL specified in the pacument. And so, yeah, so the repro that I put up, it just sets up a proxy that does this and then tries to run an install with it, and then it breaks. So that's the heart of the problem. Some of the, clearly the fact that scoped modules and unscoped modules behave differently, that seems like that's clearly a bug of some kind. But I would argue that the rewriting behavior is also something that we should change. So that's the kind of 10,000-foot view of this. I understand that some of this was about trying to make it so that changes between, when you change registries, that it would be provide better behavior. Anyway, yeah. So Isaac.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, and I haven't looked at it in a little while, the scoped versus unscoped seemed like a red herring in the example that I saw. I think the issue just had to do with how it was proxying the tarball for a scoped package, but it was not proxying the tarball for vice versa. It was proxying the tarball for an unscoped package, but it was actually rewriting both of them to the
oh, was it?
registry.
Yeah, there may have been a bug in my. Yeah, that's possible.
But that said, I completely agree with everything else. You know, we in npm 6, I think this might have even gone back further, like way back to the dark ages of like npm 1 or 2. The registry.npmjs.org host name was kind of treated as a little bit of a sort of magic placeholder string. So if you change your registry, it would be like, okay, well, I was getting this from the public registry, but you want a different registry, so let's do this other thing. Not everywhere and not entirely consistently. So rather than strip out all the magic, which we started in npm 7 and then that ended up breaking some things, we were like, okay, well, let's at least make it consistently magical. So that's the way that it went. I'm surprised and disappointed in myself that we didn't think to just like, why don't we just track the registry URL in the lock file? That's like an obvious, in retrospect, and genius idea. So we should totally do that. And then that gives us a step towards demagicking the whole thing by saying, okay, well, your registry URL is the same as the last time you installed. So these resolved URLs, I can just trust them. Or your registry URL is, your top level registry URL is now different. So any resolved URL is kind of, it's no longer trustworthy. I need to look up the actual package metadata. I think that would solve a lot of problems. Or the downside, which I called out in the issue, pretty not completely uncommon use case, is to have a like an Nginx proxy or just some other like real simple proxying registry that all it does is pass through the data exactly from the public registry. If you have something like that and you set it as your registry config instead of your proxy config, then anytime we try to make a fetch to that registry, we go, oh, okay, well, it says its tarball is at registry.npmjs.org, but actually I know better. I'm going to keep going to that same registry host. So that use case will break. That's probably fine because that's sort of an abuse of an HTTP proxy. Like you should be defining it as an actual proxy and using an HTTP proxy API, like that's what that's for. And then just leaving your registry as the public registry. So that's sort of my 2 cents on this. I think I don't off the top of my head see anything that should really change in this suggestion.
Okay.
A couple open questions that we can figure out as we go through it, but.
Any response or comments, Rebecca? Or
Yeah, sounds good.
so the path forward is to essentially introduce like a registry field in the lock file. Is that the suggestion you're making here, Isaac?
I think that's a suggestion Rebecca's making, but I'm strongly agreeing with it.
Yeah, the proposal in the RRFC is that the registry that was used to create the lock file is recorded in the lock file, which helps that like whole reproducibility story. And then if the registry that the user is installing with is different than the one in the lock file, then we invalidate all of the resolved URLs and go recompute those from the, I should say, from the Pacument data from the whatever registry you are using now, rather than trying to do magic.
Yeah, so so 2 potential questions that come to mind. One is, if we're invalidating the tarball URL, should we also be invalidating the integrity? I could see arguments for either, but I would kind of lean towards saying no, the integrity should be the same, because otherwise you're actually getting different bits, right?
Yeah, I agree with you there.
The other thing is, so even if the packment metadata contains a different integrity, well, we just blow up. We say you're trying to install something
in the usual way when you proxy to something. I mean, that's also consistent with the fact that, like, well, if that integrity exists in your cache, it's already installing that, right? So.
Oh, that's true. Then we won't even know that the result has changed because we just have it already. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So the other thing, if we're storing the lock file, if we're storing the top level registry for lock files, should we also store the registry that might be assigned to any given scope? And that I'm sort of a little more torn on, because that can, I have seen people put usernames and passwords in their scope registries, and we're also going to have to be very careful that we don't put a username or password in the packment registry. So it basically needs to do sort of a nerf darting of that registry for what we actually store. Like only store the host, the port, and the path, but nothing else.
For sure. Jordan, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was mainly just wondering if the change all sounds fine, right? I have no disagreement with anything. I was just curious, what impact is this going to have on lock file diff churn? Like knowing what I know now, if I could go back in time, I would probably suggest really strongly that the registry domain name, like that part of the tarball URL not actually be stored with each package, that rather than storing it 3,000 times, that it be stored like in one place for bare things and one place for each scope, and then like have just the subpath be in there, because that would avoid all the churn. But obviously that's not worth suggesting now. But like, I'm hoping this improvement will reduce that churn. Is that the case, or will it like not have any effect on it?
I don't think it would have any effect. I mean,
okay.
If you change your registry and then you do a normal npm install, like with save, right? We're going to change the lock file, because now we have a new registry, top level registry URL, and all the resolve fields are going to be different.
Well, and I don't mean that the lock file now shows up in git status. I mean like that any entry that isn't related to a package I'm installing should ideally not get updated. But in particular, something that I've often seen over the years is when we're using an internal registry, that depending on what the local user does, sometimes they will update every registry in their lock file to point to the public one, and then we have to do some sort of said hacky grossness to like automatically transform it back to the internal registry URL on their behalf. And maybe this is an unrelated problem. It's just, I wanted to ask.
Yeah, that does seem like it wouldn't really be affected by this.
Okay, that's fine.
And we wouldn't be reevaluating anything that we don't have to reevaluate, right? If the dependency is there and it's fine, we'll just leave it there and we won't have to look at it.
Right. Although the lock file would get updated in this case, because we'd have a completely different source for the file, and like that does still seem to be a problem.
Yeah, so
still going to produce that churn.
That's an interesting question. Let's say I have a bunch of stuff in my tree, all my dependencies are there. I change my registry and I do npm install foo -- registry equals something else. At that point now, I'm doing an install and I'm changing my registry, but only a very small portion of my tree needs to be sort of evaluated or looked at. So currently we don't re-resolve all of those dependencies, right? The question would be like, will that cause everything in my lock file to get its resolved URL re-updated to the new registry, or just the things that actually had to be looked up as part of that install? Because if it's the first one, we're going to be adding potentially quite a lot of lock file churn. And in fact, when I do npm install foo -- registry equals bar, like everything else might not even be on that bar registry. It might just be for this one dependency that I have to fetch from this one registry. It's kind of a potentially curious edge case.
And that would only work, of course, if you already had an install tree.
Right.
But yeah, that is a weird case.
Maybe it's weird enough that we just say that you use scopes. If you have one package on one registry, that's what scopes are for. Otherwise, you have to proxy the whole thing, which is sort of what we do anyway. So
Correct.
not terrible, probably.
Tierney?
I have a question. So how is this like in the lock file? What is the structure of this being proposed? Because like the one that I can see making the most sense, given we want to support multiple registries, is like having the registry as a key, and then basically whatever the current status of like all of the packages that fall under that registry as the value in their current syntax, or having like an identifier that you attach to each one. But that sounds like it adds a much larger JSON file than you want. So what's the proposal around like the syntax of that?
As I understand it, and Rebecca, definitely correct me if I'm wrong, what we're talking about is way, way smaller than that.
Yeah.
We're talking about adding a single string at the top level that is just registry : URL.
So what happens when I resolve from multiple registries?
Well, you only have one registry that is your top level registry. Right. There's only one thing that's in -- registry equals whatever.
Got you. Yeah, I guess for how does that play with scopes then? Like if I have private modules in a Verdaccio instance and a Docker image somewhere.
I mean, I think the question here is, like currently we've been discussing like when you change your default registry, but what about when you change a scoped registry so it no longer points at the same location? How should that behavior function?
Right. So in that case, perhaps as well, I mean, that might come back to that thing of like, well, then we shouldn't just store the current top level registry. We should include all of the scope registries. And then if those are different in an install process and we have to resolve one of those things, we update their resolved fields.
I guess in that situation, like I'm slightly misunderstanding. I'm mildly struggling to follow what you're saying, but I think in that situation, like, the way I've done it in the past with Verdaccio was like that scope will always be that specific registry. Like it's never going to be a public registry. It's not really changing. It's very static. And so like it's less of a like this may come from one registry or the other, but it's always going to come from that. And that's kind of where that syntax I was kind of asking about is potentially coming from, is like basically just having a key and then like a key and value where the value is the current structure of how package lock is defined, and the key is whatever the registry comes from. And in most cases that'll be a one-liner, but in like more niche cases that are more enterprisey, that'll end up being like maybe 5 lines total. That's the simplest way I can think of it. And I'm sure y'all could probably figure out something different as well. Or you could have, a single like, an object at the top, I mean, quote unquote object at the top that has all of your registries, and then have like a registry entry property on every package. But I feel like that adds way too much noise. It's completely unnecessary.
If we're going to be adding anything inside of the packages or dependencies section of the lock file, then this becomes a much larger change.
Yeah, exactly. I think that maybe slightly changing the structure is fine, but like individually changing every package is a lot more.
Yeah, it might be a good change, but it does mean a much bigger thing, and likely something that's at least one semper major away from shipping today. Whereas just adding a new top level string field, not really any big deal at all.
I mean,
Right.
yeah, we could do top level string and then add the additional syntax for scoped registries later.
Yeah, and it's really just a change detection, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just, well, is this the same registry I used to generate this lock file? If so, I don't need to re-resolve these things. I can just fetch their tarballs.
How
right?
does well, but so theoretically there though, you can use multiple registries to generate a lock file.
You can use
Presently.
one top level registry and a
Mhm.
registry attached to each scope. Yes.
Yeah.
So if the registry for a given scope has changed, then similarly, I need to re-resolve anything at that scope. I can't just fetch its tarball.
Perhaps you could just do at the top level, at that top level entry, like have a similar UI or structure for UI structure for scopes where it's like the scope and then whatever that registry value is. Like that's a potential solution that just addresses it in the same way without having.
Yeah. We
major
could,
changes.
we could even have, at foo : registry as the key, and
Yep.
then the value is a URL.
Yep.
And just if that config has changed, then we know that we can't trust anything at that URL, or can't trust anything at that scope, that its resolve value is valid still.
Yeah.
So in terms of next steps, is this something that we can get an actual RFC created for and then walk, like, because this sounds like it might be, can this actually land in a minor, or are we concerned about it being a breaking change and having to like walk this back from like npm 9?
I don't know. I mean, the use case that it breaks is pretty weird and arguably kind of an abuse of npm's current behavior, like not really using as intended. But that being said, it probably will break somebody's build. So, I always want to be sensitive to that.
So this is something that would have to land in 9.
Well, so we could start adding the
As soon as we
cut
start
it
adding,
a couple of different ways. So one
Yeah.
thing is we could add the field and we could do the re-resolution, but not strip out any of the magic, right? And that would be doable in an 8, in an 8.x, and that would not, because we would still preserve that, improper proxy kind of use case. We could also have a warning or something to say, hey, like, your proxy says that its tarballs are on registry npmjs.org, but we're not actually fetching them from there. So just FYI, that's going to break or change someday. I don't know. There's ways forward, I think.
Okay. In terms of actually queuing this up and maybe curating this, Rebecca, were you interested in making this like an actual RFC from the? If not, we can get somebody on our team.
I can do that.
this.
It's
Okay.
There's not a whole lot to this.
It's a simple change or
Yeah,
addition.
it's mostly just actually writing down the specifics of the lock file change.
And then from our side, we can try to figure out if this can land in a minor, I guess. It definitely sounds like it's like a log file version change. Would that be accurate, or are we saying this is an addition again, right? Like,
I think it could stay in lock file version 2.
Yeah, I would agree, because I think that should really be reserved for like things that break compatibility, because there is code that is like, no, I refuse to run on I don't know this lock file version, I'm not going to try.
Yeah.
removal of keys versus addition, like adding
Yeah.
keys and yeah, renaming and moving things around.
Lock file version is Semper Major only. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It's an integer. So.
Okay. So given that, then the hope is that we could potentially land this in a minor. I'm just concerned about churn again, like in people's package locks. Because as soon as we ship this, it's everybody's lock files are gonna start start updating and add this new information, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not any different than anything else that we start resolving, though. It's like if you do an install and you do an install with a save, we are going to edit your log file like that. That's how it works today. I don't think there's anything dramatic that's going to change here. We're not talking about adding, thousands of lines of changes in the normal case, unless you switch to a different registry which has different resolved URLs, in which case you actually want that.
Right. Okay. Okay. Seems straightforward then. I will add this. Okay. Any other comments before we move on? If not, feel free to continue to add to the notes, and you see some folks adding things there. I do my best to try to capture conversation, but don't always get it accurate. So feel free to modify and update accordingly. Moving on to the second item we had in the agenda. This is issue 473. NPM outdated, returns incorrect status code. I think this is like a matter of opinion. I saw Rebecca already commented back to the author of this. I think that's pretty straightforward in terms of how NPM and the CLI are actually using that status code. But I'm wondering if anybody else has feedback or comments on this.
So I would converse a lot on there. I don't actually have a strong opinion about whether NPM outdated specifically should return the code in this specific case. I just really strongly pushed back against the argument that it was somehow like violating some law or like improper for it to do so. Yeah, I totally can see the argument both ways, keeping it the same or changing it back. Rebecca's comment that it worked this way in NPM 6 suggests that it was a regression in NPM 7 that was then fixed. So like that seems compelling to me, but I appreciate that comment. That helped. Yeah, I think that it's very important that exit codes be usable to convey information and not be confined to some arbitrary standard of execution errors.
So yeah,
Gar,
Gar,
and then yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I don't have a strong opinion either. It's just that I'm on the receiving end of reviewing those, and I just want a record of the decision so I can say this is how NPM works. I'm glad to keep it as it is. I understand having an exit one, just like NPM LS, which a lot of people do in CI to make sure things are good. It makes a lot of sense to me. So just let's write it down at the end of this in this issue so that I can address any of this in the future and quickly and easily.
Yeah, I seem to recall that there was a NPM 6 used to exit one if there were outdated packages, and then in NPM 7 we mistakenly got rid of that behavior, and at some point we said oops and we fixed it. And every time you fix something, you break something. That's just never more apparent than when it comes to exit codes. So it sounds like we're all in agreement. This is working as intended.
So it's just giving the feedback and officially, I guess, blessing response. So to Gar's point, somebody on our team can comment back, and we can use that.
I think it would be useful to like for example, I have a medium opinion that like -- JSON should not ever affect the exit code. It only affects the output format.
Yes.
For example, it seems useful to come up with a like sort of set of these ideologies for npm on the command line and write them somewhere in the docs and just be like, here is how we expect everything to work. If it doesn't work this way, please file a bug. And then like we can say like every command should either, like if you pass --JSON, it should give you a JSON version of the output or it should error. Like if you pass --JSON, the exit code should always be the same as when it's not there, and like things like that. Because that will give guidance for future RFC calls as well when deciding what is the appropriate behavior.
Yeah, I just want to
100%.
second that like having that in the npm docs actually I think would be a good thing, largely because I could like, if this is documented, then it's easy to point to here are the official npm docs, and like it also helps us in the future if like there's, you know, a decision that like, oh, we just nobody ever uses this, and like realistically how often are people using like npm home or npm repo package? Like probably not a lot, like far less than install, and like that might do something weird with some flag. So just documenting it for that and either being able to change it or change the feature is a good decision log.
Rebecca?
Yeah, there is actually kind of to Jordan's point there. There is actually weird behavior in npm 6, which I've not tested in npm 8 or 7. Just from when I was looking at the source code to verify the older behavior, is that it does not set the error code if you use parsable or JSON. It only sets the error code on normal output.
Oh, okay. I think
desirable.
That was, right. That's how we ended up in this state. And then that in npm 7 broke some people's scripts that were running npm outdated in a bash script and checking the exit code to see if they were outdated packages.
It was, yeah, I mean, it was setting it anytime except for when you used parsable and JSON.
Right.
Yeah. So if you were doing it in a, yeah.
But yeah, I think to Tierney's point, documenting those output ideologies would be super, super handy, because we get into other weird cases. Like there are some commands where if you do --JSON, then some JSON gets written to standard error, but it also writes a whole bunch of logs, which are definitely not JSON. And so there's no way you can possibly parse that without stripping out all the log output. It's like, what is even the point? There's a lot of just kind of evolutionary like detritus kind of in the behavior for some of these things. So we should get more clear on that.
Okay, I've taken the action item for us to document some of these like ideologies and decisions in the npm docs. So we can definitely queue that work up and try to like even have like a one pager with some of this, and just continue to expand on it as these conversations come up, and we can try to document like the thoughts, feelings, and to give us like a explicit place to point to when people bring these kinds of issues to us. Moving on then, and I guess the other action item here is just that we're probably going to close this, referencing that doc. Close.
And maybe the earlier PR where somebody reported the bug that we were exiting with status code 0. This is proof positive that you cannot please all the people all the time.
While you're taking those notes, I did comment in the comments here that part of the confusion here was because of that exiting differently if we're in JSON unparsable, and untangling that was where this was started to get, we lost the plot. Currently, it's my understanding that exit code is not determined by whether or not you're doing JSON or parsable. So it would be safe to put that into the docs now, as this is how it does work and we expect it to work. If we want to change that, we can, but I think that would be worth at least also adding currently exit code is not altered by output format.
Yeah, we can have a whole section that's like nuances or quirks that maybe deviate from our wants from future work, right, as well. So like it may be the case that that's not what we intend to do in the future, but just like, as you said, document how things are operating today. So cool. I want to quickly move on to the last item, which may also be fairly quick conversation. This is Rfc issue 471. This is someone recommending that we exclude node modules, explicitly exclude node modules from time machine backups or any other kind of like backups like Dropbox. I think Jordan, you had responded to this as well. They do make a note in here. I don't believe they're on the call, but do make a point that Rust has taken the aim of excluding these by default. That may not make any difference to us, since obviously NPM has a legacy of 12-ish years. So this could be a bigger breaking change potentially if we implemented something like this. So I'm not sure, Jordan, if you want to.
My interest is that it for many years has driven me nuts that both Dropbox and Time Machine and Spotlight all look at node modules and get ignored things. Anything that can improve that scenario, that situation sounds good to me. And as far as like, it's sort of a Mac only consideration for Time Machine and Spotlight, but it seemed like, this was some of the later comments on it, it seems like you could just check for the presence of like X-Atchers or something and shell out to it if it's there. And just not to do that code path if it's not a Mac, basically. But I don't know.
Okay. Did you have anything? I see your hands raised.
Sorry, that's from my last comment. I didn't put it down.
No worries. Should this be opt-in though?
I feel like there's very little downside. It should be maybe opt out if you really want your node modules to be backed up in Time Machine. But I think the overwhelming majority of people just, if they're backing up their node modules folder, it's because they don't notice. Like, you have a lock file, that is compiled, generated, machine generated stuff, basically.
Well, and even on top of that, that's for Time Machine backup. So for Spotlight, if you're doing a search in your computer, how many people most of the time want to search their node modules?
Zero.
And
That's
like
going to be
all the editors filter that out by default.
Literally nobody will ever search. Like I cannot.
Well, and I have wanted that,
case.
but like then I CD into that folder and I like use a command line tool and it's fine.
Right.
Or you can in your editor, like in VS Code, you can explicitly say, yes, I want you to search in node modules, even though you normally don't. But like,
so I guess like my only concern is that we're saying nobody does, but I'm positive there's somebody out there that does use this or does rely on this behavior today. So that's my only concern.
So is it reasonable if we suspect there's virtually nobody, but we know from experience that somebody will always pop up when we think it's nobody, is an opt-out sufficient to say, hey, like we didn't realize we were going to break anybody, or like we didn't expect to break anybody in practice? Here's how you can get back the behavior you want? Or are we trying to adhere to the the idea that like what works in a major should always work?
I see Owen's hands raised, so I'll let you speak before I respond.
I was just thinking that kind of to the point of at least informing or making sure the users, properly informed. You could maybe use like a package lock, or I guess more specifically a package lock JSON to say like, hey, we see you've got a lock file, so by default, we're assuming that there's no need to not ignore your node modules. So we're going to ignore your node modules, but if you don't want us to do that, then pass this flag instead. So you could use maybe the state of the repo as a way to present the message. You could always present a message, but you could toggle the behavior based on certain artifacts as present. Whether it's breaking is quote unquote breaking, is a fuzzy decision to make, but it's a change in behavior nonetheless. So to the earlier point, that's just think of that XKCD with the space bar, so there you go.
To that, I would definitely say don't base it on package lock. Like I know a number of package maintainers intentionally turn off package lock because it can be problematic for building modules, but not like for applications. It absolutely makes sense. It's not really useful for modules in the way that like a yarn lock necessarily is because of how the because it doesn't get sent to the registry basically. And also I multiple reasons. But yeah, I would definitely say that it should probably be like kind of all or nothing with an opt-in flag or opt-out flag or an opt-in flag. I would personally prefer like the thing I try to avoid is like, oh, I've been writing JavaScript for 3 years and I didn't know this was a thing and I could have had this the whole time. That's like a painful DX to me rather than a positive one. Whereas like if someone is like, oh, I really wish node modules was showing up in Spotlight search for whatever reason. I know I've screamed the opposite before, but if someone wants that, they can go search, how do I get node modules in Spotlight? And then they have an answer. Whereas the other, you're not going to search for because you're just not going to think about it. And same for Time Machine as well, right? Like you can realize that your node modules weren't there, but you're not going to think, oh, how do I get rid of all my node modules from npm? Like that's not going to be a thing someone thinks about.
Well, and the damage from not backing up node modules is that you have to run npm install after your restore.
Right.
The damage from backing them up is your backup disk might run out of space far sooner.
Yeah.
Okay, so next steps with this is we can backlog this issue and like work item. Just based on everything else that we've got ahead of us, I'm wondering if it won't even, it might almost make sense that this would be landing like around the time, let's say, of even npm 9. Like it potentially could line up with a major release for us, depending on when we can actually get to something like this, which isn't like super high priority. So I'm just wondering, like I don't think it's necessary to ship this in a minor. So just like my preference, if it's going to be opt out, is probably that we change this behavior in a major breaking change.
I think that's fine. I'm totally fine with that, especially with 9.
Yeah, the most conservative approach would be that we add it as opt-in today in a minor, and then it becomes opt-out in the next major. Again, this is all assuming that if we can set that X attribute, that extended attribute from within Node, then this is really easy to implement. If we have to rely on the Xattr binary or ship a binary node add-on only for Darwin, that's possible. It gets into some like code signing issues and like shipping compiled code that can sometimes set off some security alerts. So there's a little bit of implementation hassle here, and it might even be worth adding sending a PR to Node and saying, okay, well, when Node gives us this field, then we'll start using it.
I've taken a couple action items. Wanted to give the floor for folks. We have about 13 minutes left. If there was any other items or discussion topics people want to bring up. If not, I'll give you 12 minutes back of your days, and appreciate everybody jumping on today. Hopefully see you next week and talk to you async in the RFC issues and pull requests themselves. Cheers.
Bye.